All right, let us begin. Welcome everybody to the Relational Matters Archive conversation number 4 with Eva Hayward. It is a great pleasure to see you all again. My name is Katrin Thiele. I'm the initiator of this project, and otherwise I'm teaching and researching in the Grad Agenda program at Utrecht University. Here with us is also Ida Hillerup Hansen, a PhD researcher at Utrecht University and co-organizer of the Relational Matters Archive. Ida oversees in these sessions the technical details and will also moderate the session's chat, which can be used by all of you who are here participating live. Ida, will you say a few words about that?
Yes, hello everyone and welcome. So Relational Matters Archives is running a series of conversations like this one throughout the spring and the summer of 2022. The conversations are recorded and they will be available at the webpage, where you can also go to learn more about the project. So each conversation is loosely structured around the same 3 questions, and it will last about 45 minutes, followed by a 10 to 15 minutes Q&A. And we encourage all attendees to share your questions in the chat, and then I will raise as many as possible after the conversation. And we kindly ask you to not switch on the camera or audio if it's possible for you during the event. Yeah, that I will give the floor to Katrin and Eva.
Thank you, Ida. To start off, let me rehearse first in a few words the aim of the Relational Matters Archive, the work it hopes to do, and then introduce to you also today's interlocutor. The Relational Matters Archive aims to collect insights and divergent practices dealing with relationality as a starting point for research inquiries and ways of living. The archive is part of a project in which 2 claims are interwoven in the attempt to engage with and attune ourselves to today's planetary condition. On the one hand, an engagement with relational matters, which expresses an insistence on the interactive and messily entangled condition of current times. And on the other hand, the statement that relation matters, meant as an ethico-political wager to become more literate and more carefully attuned to what entanglement as living condition implies. That is, what does such a claim ask from us when living it? It is important for me to emphasize that to take a relational point of departure does not propose relationality as a solution in itself. Rather, our conversations around relational matters want to inquire what relationality means in specific contexts and on different scales, and how a relational approach could offer significant insights to what is happening around, amongst, within us, and to also discuss limits of it. That much on the purpose of this online archive. I would now like to turn to today and introduce to you today's special guest, Eva Hayward, with whom I look forward to engage in a conversation around the questions we always use for these sessions. Also, this session is still happening in times of the war in Ukraine, and there's no need, I think, to remind us of this. Yet it also feels important to once more mention it, because relational matters have so much and so often to do with violence and death. And to be able to have conversations in such time is maybe even a rather exceptional situation when it comes to earthly relational matters. Let me now introduce Eva Hayward to you, who will engage in today's conversations with me and all of us. Eva Hayward is a creative non-fiction writer and theorist in the Department of Media and Culture Studies at Utrecht University. Before she arrived here and joined the Gender Studies team in the department, which is not all too long ago, Eva was an associate professor at the University of Arizona in the US, where she has also worked in the context of the Transgender Studies Initiative. Eva describes herself as an anti-disciplinary scholar. Her training from the History of Consciousness department at the University of California at Santa Cruz is in the history of science, film, and art history, but also in psychoanalytic semiotics, paying specific attention to the persistence of sexuality and aesthetics in the structuring of knowledge, subjectivity, and power. Her written work is known to many of us. She has written field-defining essays in both transgender and science studies, such as, for example, her very well-known Fingery Eyes article, Impressions of Cup Corals from 2010, or also the More Lessons from a Starfish, the Lessons and the More Lessons from a Starfish, published in Women's Studies Quarterly. She's the most proliferate writer, so it's impossible to do really justice to your work here, Eva. But maybe one more mention of a recent publication next to the one that was also extra mentioned for the session today, Painted Camera Her from Eflux Journal. I want to name that Eva was a co-editor together with Jay Gossett for the special issue Trans in the Time of HIV/AIDS in Transgender Studies Quarterly in 2021, which to me is a very timely publication during pandemic times. And having had some earlier opportunities already to exchange and share thoughts with you, Eva, while you weren't yet in our vicinity, I'm more than thrilled now that you agreed to also become part of our Relational Matters archive. And so, without further delay, let's start with the first question. So we start with the first question, and I really read it out loud. How does relationality actually figure in your work? How would you say are you engaged with relationality, or from which angle would you say you are engaging with relational matters?
Thank you so much, Catherine and Ida, for inviting me to be part of this archive. It's quite wonderful to be in conversation already with thinkers that I admire, like Anna Poletti and Domi Olivieri, who were speakers I had seen prior, and then in addition to previous speakers before them. These are questions that have mattered a lot to me in different ways over the arc of my critical engagement, my critical study. So for me, the question of the relational is of course central to different iterations of my theoretical work. It has changed over time. I think importantly, and it's something that you raised in your introduction, Catherine, that the question of the relation has always, for me, been contingent on the context of that relation, the specificity of that relationship, if you will, that sometimes we talk about the relational and even matter for that matter in these generalized ways, in these expansive, even capacious ways. And I often find that in that context, though it carries a kind of philosophical thrill or theoretical sophistication, that often it loses its particularity, its political orientation. So as I've written about relationality differently in feminist science studies and also in trans and sexuality studies, I would not say I've written extensively, interestingly, in gender studies, mostly as a critique of gender as it has organized the subject of the transsexual. So for me, the question of the relational is always bound up or tied to the specificity of scale and context. And so it really matters for me how one begins the site or location of one's inquiry. I hope that's the beginning of an answer to that question.
I maybe can come in with something that I would feel you might be able to elaborate even a little bit further, thinking of your work that is very much around about within the rethinking and exactly detailed thinking through sexual differences. And so you very much emphasize, I think, differences or the differing.
Mm-hmm.
And nonetheless, would you be able to say that that is an anchor or kind of an angle with which you also touch on that issue that you now described as how you would relate to the relational matters? That is one thing. I think I would love to hear a little bit more about how sexual differences and how you emphasize differences in this context, and if you have what connection. And the other thing that came to mind when I read your text again now, the one that you gave to us, is that you very much relate also. You're very interested in the question of sex. You're very much interested in that, also the libidinal, in that exploration. And you always indeed contextualize it also as something that has to be thought together, or brought into relation with question of racialization, or the feminine as, of course, a racialized concept. So also here, maybe could you maybe say if I'm on the right track, so to speak, with you, but also how that I see that as really something where you indeed produce you touch on relational matters as I see it, but also produce specific relation that you find very important to make.
Yeah, I mean, the question of difference and differentiation, not simply difference as an ontological orientation. I think this is maybe a misreading of what I'm trying to do. To some degree, I'm critical of the ontological project, but that is not a foreclosure of difference and processes of differentiation. So I am deeply interested in the difference that is transsexual womanhood, not as inherent or essentialized location, but really as an ongoing, iterative and transformative event for the transsexual subject, particularly transsexual woman. So we often think about transsexuality in the specificity of transition as an ecstatic moment for the subject, in which the subject is either surgically, juridically, in terms of changing names or changing pronouns, socially, or hormonally, which I would say is an expansive understanding of organismic transformation, that sexual difference continues to work upon and work through the processes of transsexuality, not to reify the binaristic. I don't think sexual difference has much to do with binarisms. It's a kind of repudiation of the complexity of sexual difference. Rather, I think of transsexual sexuality and sexualness and sex as yet new formations, or different formations, maybe not even that new, different formations of sexual difference. So for me, this as one instance of the relational, how does the transsexual woman become, in a kind of ongoing way, then these various forces she must contend with, and they have significant and I think unanswered implications. That in many ways, what is a transsexual woman remains permanently unavailable to us.
Yeah. And anything super, I like very much that you could also already specify that. I think we will get to those to your thinking there in more detail soon. But anything still about sex and race?
So I think the question of sex and race that becomes central in much of my, I would say in 2017, I did an essay called Don't Exist, which is really a critique of the ways in which trans studies has relied on shareability and generalizability, how to think about gender in its most expanded form, much of it coming out of a rather troubling, to me, intellectually troubling work in queer theory that made gender endlessly expandable. In making gender endlessly expandable, often we found that while it produced these rather exhilarating acrobatic feats of identification, that it often was predicated on the necessary foreclosure, even in the form of killability of trans women of color, particularly Black trans women. So as we watched field formation happen within trans studies, an incredibly exhilarating moment within trans studies that found itself in particularly in the US Academy, that much of it was predicated on the narrative of the dead trans woman of color. And so for me, that the ways in which racialization is central to the field formation of trans studies has been one of the relational questions I've attended to. I think secondly, and maybe returns to the question of sexual difference, is that to what degree we are able to translate or attempt to translate sex and gender into meaningful categories are already the legacy of racialization. And I think that this has been well argued for decades now within Black feminist inquiry. I think it continues to be really compellingly argued in the work of Zakiya Amon-Jackson, among others, that the very logic of sex and gender, not just its binaristic structures, but also its ecstatic structures, the transitional structure, has to somehow contend with the role of racialization as the subtending logic or structure or imagination through which sex and gender, both as norms and sex and gender as transgressed, can be made meaningful. So in these multiple registers, with one field formation and one more foundational, have been important for me to think through.
Yes, exactly. I find this very important. Also in terms exactly that these relational matters, as I now call it in this project, are also the underlying, often not even directly addressed, but underlying concerns that we have. And I know from your work that you indeed really try to bring that out very much, both in this way of, as you say, sex gender, but also in the way how you specifically intervene in trans studies. And I find that extremely interesting. Let's move on to the question number 2, namely, which methodological shifts do you see emerging from a relational approach in your research, but also maybe in other practices you do? I know that you're also artistic practices. So please share with us what you like to say.
Yeah, if I may indulge in a bit of biography.
Yes, please.
That, I start out as an artist, a sculptor at Dartmouth College, working in ceramics, and somehow perversely find myself in the scene of conservation science because artists were enlisted as having particular skills at pattern recognition for humpback whale conservation science. So I was then involved in the photo identification of humpback whales, looking at migratory patterns. And it was this encounter with science as an artist that made me wonder about what was possible within science, or what was science itself in relationship to art. So I think this, for me, was a central question that prompted me to do graduate work thinking about the aesthetics in the history of science, particularly in marine science, where organisms lacked easy identificatory registers. And so a different vocabulary, aesthetic vocabulary, was produced in the scientific literature, both in the history of that scientific literature, but continued into the present. And these questions were really foundational for me. I think what was central in this dissertation work that focused on the aesthetics of marine science, uninterested entirely in trans studies, even though I was a trans woman writing about the aesthetics of marine science. I intentionally did not want to write about my subjectivity as a dissertation project. But the question that shaped me was how signification, how the poetics and aesthetics of language and meaning found its way into the discourses around the materiality, the biologies, the life ways of organisms, that there was already this conflation between, to use Donna Haraway's terms, material semiotics. There was already this conflation between meaning and signification and scientific practice, not simply in the metaphors used, but literally these organisms have their own languages, in a way, if you will, not at all comparable to ours, but in terms of if we would allow language to include, atom structures, biochemical structures, that these organisms have their own signifying practices, and here signifying in a much more capacious way than we think of, that this was central for me in writing that dissertation. But as exhilarating as that was, and as destabilizing as that work was to the kind of biocentrism, the biologism, if you will, of marine science itself, I found myself questioning the ways in which psychic life began to show up in the organization of scientific experiments. So later work shifted more toward studying science experimentation protocols to really see how the psychic life of science designed itself within the laboratory practice. So there became a question about the presence of sexuality in a place that's unimaginable, particularly for the sciences, which is in scientific design or experimental design. How is sexuality already at work there? So a question of negativity began to emerge in the feminist science studies work. I think in many ways that negativity was already central in the work I was doing on trans studies. Even in the essay, Lessons from a Starfish, which is about art, often when I'm writing about transness, I'm interested in transsexuality as a particular form of art making, actually, not as ontology, but an aesthetic and sexual art, if you will, which perhaps is more needs to be said about that, but I'll leave it there. And in that work, the question of sexuality always showed up, but always within the frame of difference, which I took from the field of feminist science studies. So even in the Starfish essay, though it sometimes gets written about in these incredibly expansive ways, it's really very narrowly about a particular aspect of transsexual womanhood that I wanted to think through. Even though it expands from there, it really focuses very narrowly on that. So it's shifted. My relationship to relationality has shifted.
Thanks. Can I ask for a bit more clarification? So you would say, if I understand you correctly, that methodological shift, I mean, what you described from your trajectory also, you always brought dimensions into, say, the field of science via, via from an art perspective, from an aesthetic perspective, and there things blurred and became otherwise. And so new questions emerged for you. That is, I think, exactly something that I would say speaks to me for a methodological shift, that if you are not trying to classify too much about where you put whom and what into which context, then, indeed a methodological shift can emerge, and questions of sexuality came to the fore, for example, for you in the laboratory. That is something I feel like is what I see with the methodological shift. Where I was not exactly sure what you meant when you said and then came in negativity, and that is where I just what does the methodological? Can you say something? I would be interested in saying something about methodological shift in terms of negativity. I would be very interested.
So part of my training was in psychoanalysis alongside feminist science studies. So work looking at both psychoanalytic semiotics, but also the history of Freudian psychoanalysis, practices and teachings within Freudian psychoanalysis, and then later Laplanche and Fanon, that there was, for me, even as a graduate student, that would then travel throughout my work, is a question of sexuality's presence in the process of thinking that could not easily be rendered as could not easily be rendered. And that for me was a sort of central question, is how do we attend to the unconsciousness of our practices? We hold space for that unconsciousness, which is for me always the question of sexuality. So that was, I think, even in the science studies work, the question that haunted that project was, how do animals function as particular kinds of places to administer sexual fantasy or sexual ideas about sexuality itself. And that those spaces within my scholarship have remained really central. And then in terms of field formation, I've wondered, especially in the section in the essay that Gossett, Che and I wrote, where I try to think through the field formation of trans studies. And in that section, I wonder how discourse itself manages or administrates the sexual, manages the erotophobic structures of social life. And that even discourses like queer theory, ironically perhaps, and maybe less so trans studies, at least less so ironically, has relied upon a defense against the sexual as a way of organizing its central heuristics and analytic projects. So that, I would say, is the presence of sexuality in the form of negativity that has been at work in that thread of my scholarship.
Thank you. I want to add that I find it, want to just bring to the fore once more to what you now said, also with what you said before, that your thinking or your scholarship and your research, but also the way how you, what you're interested in is exactly not to have a too generalizable or too expansive understanding of everything. But indeed, I like very much how you tell us here what Lessons from Starfish is for you. I can see that really, and also in your text that you gave here, the text on Rutherford's art, is that you say more than once in this that you want to indeed think of transsexual womanhood as a question of art, but not as art as a technology of self. but as art in the way that you right now describe it, as a sexualness, or as something that is doing something. And there I feel if the relational comes in, as I, of course, you might take it for granted, but because you're also a science studies scholar and very much trained in that, the more than human and that relational aspect in that we're not kind of here speaking of a human exceptionalist point of view of art, for example, is, I think, very important. Is there anything more you feel of saying to the methodological? Because otherwise we would, if you don't have anything, I'm moving on, but I don't want to.
Please, yeah.
Okay. Because I'm thinking, about our nice format to keep it in time. So speaking about already what you're doing and what you are a little bit hesitant about, or kind of also want to make clear what your work is not doing and what you feel your work also works against, where do you see dangers, tensions, or limitations in taking relationality as a starting point, or as something that one is focusing on in this case now, I would say, in your research, or what kind of things come up for you with this question?
I think that when one takes seriously the specificity of a relationship, that maybe is slightly distinct even from the discourse of relationality, that relationality is somehow already, to my ear, which is maybe an aesthetic issue again, to my ear is already an abstraction of the specificity of relationships, which are unavoidable. I mean, foundationally for us as intellectuals, the relationship is everywhere, a problem, a provocation, a proposal. So for me, thinking about specific relationships helps me understand that every effort to construct a relationship is also to foreclose a relationship, that the relational or the relationship has itself a negativity, that it is in many ways already, or is in many ways a construction of connectivity, of engagement that has in some other way, some other dimension of its specificity created a foreclosure. So the challenge, I think, is that in the abstracted frame of relationality, one can continue to see the relational as ongoing or iterative, in that Deleuzian sense of and. But the relationship in its specificity often confronts us with its but or nor or, that in many ways the relationship necessitates a foreclosure. I think this is the point that I wanted to make when talking about don't exist, that as the field constructed of trans studies constructed an expansive, all-inclusive, shareable framework for trans studies, that in many ways it relied upon a kind of transgressive exceptionalism that was already a foreclosure to many trans subjects, to many transsexual subjects, to most, if not all, trans subjects of color and Black trans subjects, that the exceptionalism was itself a legacy of liberal humanism, and not that all humanism or liberalism necessarily is problematic, but it relies on a very simplified, I think, version of this to create this coherence, conceptual coherence. So for me, the relationship must be specific so that the question of the political can be foregrounded.
Yeah, that I find extremely interesting. I want you to continue talking here. That I think also, yeah, I cannot but really emphasize that I agree very much that it is the danger of a too abstract or universal sounding idea of relationality and connectivity that indeed is repeating rather than breaking with the dynamics of in and exclusion. We could also translate it, I think, this way. And so specificity, and what does specificity to any of our questions, is really what I find very interesting, by taking a starting point nonetheless from a relational point. Because one question would be, I could ask you, so if I hear you correctly, I see that connectivity or relationality discourse easily pretends as if there is no foreclosure, no but or no. But would you say it is more like it is? I would say it's definitely, that is what it is, but that does not for me yet mean that, say, relationship is not exactly also foreclosure. Mm-hmm. See what I'm saying? I mean, I don't want to say that everything is the same. I don't want to say that at all, but I want to provoke maybe also to say like that. For me, the relational is not only that connects, but also exactly that precisely has that problem, and also maybe in learning to live with that problem. That's where I find the relational maybe important to emphasize, that foreclosure indeed might be unavoidable in some way, but it is the worst if it is pretended as if it wouldn't exist when we say relationality. So I just would like to ask you a little bit more, to elaborate a little bit more from this. Also precisely what you now said, in the sense of what you think that happens maybe with trans studies or trans studies communities, or what that is, because I felt for there's your work is extremely important there, I would say, and original there. So please just continue maybe with me here a little bit more.
Yeah. So to do a specific instance, one of the questions that I posed with Che in our special issue on HIV/AIDS and trans studies was how HIV/AIDS in particular made trans studies, specifically in the US, that AIDS happens in the US at the moment in which trans studies is being imagined, not by trans studies proper, as we might now call it, with the text of Susan Stryker and Sandy Stone, but already the trope of transgendering had taken root in queer theory itself. One of the ways that Che and I began to think through that question was, what was it about HIV/AIDS that produced the necessary figuration of transgender as a way of expanding queer theory's project, or at least some tenets of queer theory, major tenets, I would argue. One of the approaches for J. Prosser was that it produced the necessary potential for gays and lesbians to unify under gender as a way to respond to the AIDS pandemic. I find this a rather optimistic and suspicious project for Prosser to propose. And Gosse and I suggest that two other variables take root within queer theory. One is the erotophobic structure begins to take shape. And this, I think, is elaborated by other thinkers in later work. But anyway, we can talk about that more. But the erotophobic structure within queer theory begins to imagine gender as this processes of identification as sexuality itself. So sexuality as the antisocial force it might be and is in everyday life, particularly in the moment of pandemic that is literally unraveling the sociality, that the turn toward gender as an erotic or sexual site and processes of identification as themselves sexuality seem to me a symptomatic response to HIV/AIDS. Curiously, what is happening in the US around HIV/AIDS is both the homophobic screen discourse, and this is coming from the work of Jared Sexton and Adam Geary, how homophobia in the US hides the state-sanctioned anti-Black racism of the AIDS pandemic, such that in the criminalization of HIV really targets Black communities in the US, but the ways in which the AIDS discourse gets shaped in terms of sexual promiscuity, in terms of decadence, is a way to actually hide the understanding of HIV/AIDS as also about the anti-Blackness, anti-Black racism in the US, that this seemed to me as central to the question of queer theory's transgendering rather than tertiary or simply a kind of later development. So Che and I wanted to reposition both erotophobia and anti-Blackness as the ways in which queer theory, slightly different from trans studies, use of the figure of the transgender, and also, I would argue, queer theory's turning away from the transsexual, I think is also a part of this story. So, I mean, as an instance, this feels to me a way of thinking through where foreclosures happen, where unthinking happens even in the act of a kind of capacious theoretical invention.
Thank you. I think this is a wonderful ending for us too. Our time is already up, but I really like that you clarified once more the kind of the gesture of, shareability as something that, and then pointed out the problematic. So thank you so much, Eva, for this so far. We have now the time for Ida to come back for sure, but also for all of you who are here to raise maybe questions in the chat to Eva and to our conversation. So please just use the chat, or Ida, you can also start us off maybe with a question if you want to.
Yes, sure. Thanks for this wonderful exchange. It was really exciting to listen to. I was just, Eva, before you said, you mentioned your thinking about transness as art making. You said it might need some more elaboration, and I think I read some of it in the text, but I would just love to hear you speak a bit more of that aesthetic and sexual art, you said.
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
I mean, for me, the code of aesthetics, I'm not taking from aesthetic philosophy. For me, the aesthetic turn that I'm describing comes from Freud, who didn't say very much about aesthetics, but wrote truly beautiful essay about Leonardo da Vinci's paintings, in which Freud makes curious inroads, I would say, into the sexuality of aesthetic gestures or aesthetic marks. Leo Bersani, in a really important essay called Sexuality and Aesthetics, begins to understand or help us understand aesthetic gestures or poetic effects as sexuality hidden in plain sight, as aesthetic form. I find this really quite inspiring, and this has led me to think differently about the ways in which femininity for not that all transsexual women are interested in femininity or marks of femininity, but for those who are, I have found it interesting to think about the acts of bodily femininity, whether through style, through surgery, through various kinds of expressivities, as sexual expressions, as sexual aestheticizations, as a way of sidestepping the question of being and the question of even becoming, that one might desire femininity, one might desire transsexuality. It seems very politically risky, because this is in many ways the critique that we get of transness in general, is that somehow transness is not legitimate or not substantive. But I find that one needs to revalue the presence of sexuality, revalue the importance of the aesthetic, and that one suddenly realizes that this understanding of trans as artfulness may be much more substantive than general, than a kind of casual, autonomy, active autonomy. I don't see it that way at all. Sexuality itself is not.
Okay, thank you so much for that.
Now it comes. We
have many
questions
are ticking in. I will just start from an end. So Anna asks, Eva Kuhn, can you speak a little bit more about the antisocial power of eroticism? Can you describe the characteristics of sexuality and or eroticism that put it in conflict with the social?
Maybe we have to think a little bit taking them together, otherwise we are not making this. So there's the antisocial power of eroticism, Eva. What's the next one?
The next one is, well, goes more to your...
But I think by Susanne Jesus.
Yeah. I was wondering whether you might be able to expand on relationality, particularly in relation to your marine scholarship. And I'm thinking here of the common connotation of the watery and oceanic as fluid, and how this also has been transposed on thinking sex, gender.
A wonderful question. And the last one, if I hope you can...
Can you take one more? Yeah. I wonder how this conversation relates to different notions of the unarticulable. Right, Stefan? I think of different thinkers valuing the unarticulable, like Federico Campaign. Yeah, Keeling. Sorry.
Please, Eva.
So say about the antisocial, that I don't think that the traditions out of which I'm understanding sexuality's presence is necessarily the antisocial. I mean, this is particularly Edelman's use of Lacan, but there are other traditions that imagine the sexual within the political, the discursive, that allow for the presence of the sexual, not as a kind of reassertion or reification of the social world, but don't necessarily are structured as antagonistic to the social world. So there's one of Laplanche's last essays, which really I think is perhaps the most important essay I've read on trying to offer a psychoanalysis of gender, really tries to understand the relationship between sex and gender as already an activated space of sexuality. So that gender isn't, well, anyway, I could go into this in a lot more detail, and maybe we should talk about it otherwise it will take up all the rest of the time. The second question about water, oceans and water.
Yeah, exactly. The rationality of this, the fluidity, and then how it is transposed in thinking of sex gender.
Yeah, I don't actually think about water as a metaphor for sex and gender, I must admit. I do think the oceanic is an interesting trope, but again, for me, it's a Freudian concept. So Freud imagines the oceanic as a fantasy, a ego fantasy of connectivity, that what one wants in adulthood is a return to when the world was simpler and everything was me. And that the oceanic, as is imagined through Freud, is to some degree a desire for everything to rebound or be built around ego structures. That said, of course, the life ways, whether it's the molecular structure of water, whether it's the life ways of organisms in the water, I do not see them as about the ways in which human social structures like sex and gender are constructed, but I see them as necessarily offering opportunities to de-ontologize or reimagine what the limitations of our own investments are. So around sex and gender. Sorry, I'm racing through these questions too quickly. And then the third question about the remind me again of the third question.
Unarticulable.
Yeah.
I think Stalin unarticulable, like Federico Campaign and Kara Keeling.
Yeah. Those are texts that I'm not, those are writers. I mean, Kara Keeling's first book, The Witch's Flight, I find really provocative about film and Black femme within film using a Deleuzian structure. And then the other text I'm less familiar with, but I would say about what's a central question for me in thinking about transsexual life has been the narratives that are produced around transsexuality limit the imagination of what transsexuality might be. So while I don't, I'm really reluctant to invest in the kind of medicalized discourse around transsexuality, and I find it quite problematic in many ways, delimiting what transsexuality might be for transsexual women in particular. I also think questions around the artfulness of desire and embodiment, thinking through those questions invites us to simply contest, maybe not make endlessly open, but simply contest the very adumbrated ways in which we think through narrative structures of sex and gender. So this doesn't answer your question properly, but it perhaps offers some insight in how I might approach the inarticulable.
Thanks. I also would say that for the last question, I think what you spoke about in terms of foreclosure, what gets, normally what often gets, what is the danger to get be overlooked or covered over by shareability, connectivity, could also be one way of thinking about the unarticulable still in that sense. So I just want to add that. We have to stop, unfortunately. It would always be lovely to continue our conversation, but thank you so much, Eva, for your wonderful session, and all of you who are here, a live audience, and thanks so much for these wonderful questions also. As always, I want to say, please stay tuned to what's to come from our Relational Matters archive. Ida will upload the video in about a week's time, and you can visit our website at relationalmattersarchive.nl. And I would like to announce already our 5th conversation that will happen on June 1, on the 1st of June, and it will be with Jolandi Sola-Zoli van der Heide, an exhibition curator at the Van Abbe Museum in Eindhoven. And there we want to talk with Jolande in the context of the just opened exhibition, A Lasting Truth is Change. And we are offered to do so at the Van Abbe itself, which is very exciting. So while this conversation will be part of our online archive later on the day, and for all of you who would like to join, we can gather, whoever is in the Netherlands can gather at the Van Abbe. We will send around the announcement very soon, and also the specific details of how this all will take place. We just wanted to already mention it, so please remember 1st of June. And all these lovely messages we get in here for thanks and wonderful. Thank you, Eva, once more for your thoughtful interventions to our archive.